I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe it was the way Hannah said I wouldn't, like she knew I was too scared. Or maybe it was the dozen likes on her post about calling me out. Either way, I was sitting cross-legged on my bed, staring at my wrist with a black Sharpie in hand. 690452. It didn't mean anything, just 6 random numbers that TikTok decided were creepy. I told myself that as I carefully scrawled the sequence on my skin. My friend said the trend was fake, a dumb game for clout. Even the videos where people swore weird things happened were obviously staged, but there was something about the idea of it, about those numbers. Write them before you sleep, and you'll dream of a world where heaven and hell collide, the trend claimed. If you die in the dream, you die in real life. That's what Hannah's TikTok said, in her best spooky narrator voice. She made it sound ridiculous, like a campfire ghost story. So why did my chest feel tight? I texted her. Me. Okay, I did it. Happy? Hannah. LOL. No way. Film it, we need proof. Proof. As if I'd be able to record anything while sleeping. But I snapped a quick photo of my wrist, the ink smudging slightly under the dim glow of my desk lamp. Me. Done? See you in the morning? Hannah. If you wake up. I threw my phone onto the nightstand, muttering about her flair for dramatics, and slid under the covers. My mind raced. What if the dream didn't come? What if it did? What if it was nothing? It had to be nothing. This was just a dumb TikTok challenge. People make stuff up all the time for views. Still, when I finally turned out the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room anymore. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the usual hum of the house, the faint creak of the wooden beams settling, the occasional rush of wind against the window. It was quiet, too quiet. Normally I'd hear the distant sound of the neighbour's dog barking or the faint murmur of my parents' TV downstairs. Tonight, it was just still. My eyelids grew heavy as I tried to rationalize the silence. Nothing was happening. TikTok was fake, the trend was fake, and soon I'd wake up and laugh about how ridiculous I'd been. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up, or at least I thought I woke up. My room looked the same at first. The soft glow of my nightlight in the corner, the messy pile of clothes on my chair. But something was off. The air was colder, sharper, like stepping into a freezer. The shadows didn't feel like they belonged to the things that cast them. They stretched too long, moved too slowly, twisting like they were alive. I tried to sit up, but my body felt sluggish, heavy, like I was underwater. My heart thudded in my chest as I glanced down at my wrist. The numbers were gone. Instead, they were etched onto the ceiling above me, glowing faintly like they'd been burned into the wood. 690452. What the hell? I whispered, or tried to. My voice sounded muffled like I was speaking through cotton. The shadows moved again, closer this time, pooling at the edges of my bed. Panic clawed at my throat as I struggled to move. A faint hum filled the air, low and vibrating, like the sound of distant machinery, or was it chanting? I couldn't tell. All I knew was that I wasn't alone anymore. I didn't fall asleep. At least I don't think I did. But suddenly the world tilted and I was no longer in my room. The bed, the walls, the glowing numbers, they dissolved into darkness, leaving me standing in a vast empty expanse. The floor beneath me was smooth and reflective, like black glass, stretching endlessly in every direction. Ahead of me a faint light flickered, drawing me forward. I didn't want to go, but my feet moved on their own, each step echoing unnaturally loud. As I approached, the light took shape, a doorway, tall and arched, pulsing with a dull red glow. Engraved above it were the same numbers, 690452. Beneath them, faint words I couldn't quite make out, like they were shifting before my eyes. The hum grew louder, almost deafening now, and I felt a presence behind me. Slowly I turned, my breath hitching as I saw it. Just a shadow at first, impossibly tall and jagged, with burning pinpricks of light where eyes should be. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out, and then it started moving towards me. I stumbled backward as the shadow moved closer. My legs felt like lead, and the ground beneath me, smooth and endless, offered no grip. The thing didn't run or jump. It just moved, a silent rush of black, collapsing the space between us faster than I could comprehend. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. At the last second, my body finally obeyed. I twisted to the side, falling hard against the cold, glassy surface. My palms stung and I scrambled to get up, glancing over my shoulder. The shadow stood still now, just a few feet away, towering over me. Its eyes flickered like dying embers. "What do you want?" I yelled, though my voice barely carried. The thing tilted its head, almost like it was curious. Then it raised an arm, if you could call the jagged mass of darkness an arm, and pointed toward the doorway glowing in the distance. "No, no way," I muttered, shaking my head. "I'm not going in there." The shadow didn't move. It just waited, silent and still, as if it knew I didn't have a choice. A sharp pain flared in my wrist, and I looked down. The numbers, 690452, were carved into my skin now, fresh and bleeding. My head spun as panic took hold. This wasn't a dream, it couldn't be. The hum returned, louder and more insistent, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. The shadow didn't need to say anything, I understood. If I didn't move, it would force me. "Fine," I snapped, more to myself than to it. "I'll go." I stood, my legs shaking, and turned toward the door. Every step felt like wading through tar, the air growing heavier as I approached. The light from the archway pulsed, a heartbeat that seemed to sync with my own. The closer I got, the more I could make out the faint words engraved beneath the numbers. They were Latin. I recognized that much from school, but they shifted constantly, making it impossible to read. My fingers brushed the edge of the doorway and the red glow flared, blinding me. When the light faded, I was somewhere else entirely. The new world felt wrong. The air was thick and suffocating, buzzing faintly with that same hum. It wasn't like before. This was louder, invasive, burrowing into my skull like a swarm of invisible insects. I couldn't tell if it was real or just in my head. I clutched my temples, trying to block it out, but the sound only grew stronger, like it knew I was resisting. My hands trembled as I looked around. The space was vast, stretching endlessly in every direction, but the horizon wavered, shifting like heat rising off asphalt. There were shapes in the distance, jagged, angular forms that twisted when I tried to focus on them. They weren't natural. Nothing here was. I told myself it was just a dream. That's what this was supposed to be, right? A lucid nightmare conjured by some stupid TikTok dare. But then, why did it hurt? My wrist still burned where the numbers had been carved. I touched the wound, and it was wet, sticky with blood. "This isn't real," I whispered, my voice thin and shaky. "This isn't real." But the words didn't help. They sounded hollow, like a prayer I didn't believe. The ground beneath my feet was solid, the air was cold, and every fibre of my being screamed that this was real. More real than the world I'd left behind. I spun around searching for the shadow, but it was gone. Somehow, that was worse. At least when it was there, I knew where the danger was. Now every flicker of movement, every distant echo, felt like a threat. I was alone, or so I thought. The hum shifted, taking on a rhythm. Voices. Faint and fragmented, like whispers through a crack in the wall. They came from nowhere and everywhere, overlapping in a language I didn't understand. I covered my ears, but the voices poured through, relentless. "Stop it!" I screamed, my voice breaking. The whispers paused just for a moment. Then they spoke in unison, a single word that sent ice down my spine. "Choose." My stomach dropped. "Choose what?" I asked, spinning around, desperate for an answer. There was no one there, just the endless shifting void. The voices didn't respond, but the hum resumed, growing louder, more insistent. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as tears blurred my vision. The pressure was unbearable, like my skull was being squeezed in a vice. "I didn't want this," I sobbed. "It was just a stupid dare." The ground beneath me pulsed, a deep, resonant thrum that knocked me onto my back. I stared up at the sky, or what should have been the sky. Instead, I saw the numbers again, burning bright and unyielding, 690452. The whispers returned, softer this time, and one voice rose above the rest. It was calm, almost gentle, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. "Choose," it said again, as the world around me began to ripple and collapse. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The word hung in the air. Choose, its weight pressing down on me, wrapping around my chest like a vice. The voices fell silent again, but the hum remained, pulsing through my body like a second heartbeat. The ground beneath me began to shift, rippling like water, and I scrambled to my feet, swaying as the once stable surface turned treacherous. The shapes in the distance were closer now, jagged and menacing, though they didn't seem to move. It was like they had always been there, waiting for me to notice. "I don't understand," I shouted into the void. My voice came back to me, warped and distorted, as if the place itself were mocking me. "What do you want me to choose?" The only answer was the numbers above me, glowing brighter and brighter until I had to shield my eyes. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't distant. They were inside my head, crawling through my thoughts like they belonged there. I staggered backward, clutching my temples, but the whispers didn't stop. They weren't words anymore. They were memories, my memories, flashing before my eyes like a distorted slideshow. My bedroom, Hannah's TikTok, the Sharpie in my hand, the numbers scrawled on my wrist. And then something else, something I didn't recognize. A room bathed in red light, a figure standing in the shadows, a hand reaching out toward me. I gasped and stumbled, my knees hitting the ground hard. The memory, if it was a memory, was gone, but the sensation lingered, a cold, crawling dread that left me breathless. "No," I whispered to myself, shaking my head. "This isn't real. None of this is real." But the place didn't care what I believed. The hum grew louder, and the shapes in the distance began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, like they were sliding across the surface towards me. Their edges shimmered, breaking apart and reforming as they came closer. They didn't look human. I turned toward the doorway, the one I'd come through, but it was gone. The glowing arch had dissolved into the darkness, leaving me trapped in this endless shifting nightmare. The whispers surged, no longer asking but demanding, "Choose!" I clenched my fists, my pulse hammering in my ears. I couldn't choose. I didn't even know what the options were. And yet, some part of me knew that if I didn't, something worse was waiting. The figures slid closer, and I could no longer deny it. They were coming for me. They moved in ways that weren't possible, shifting and reforming like liquid, their edges blurring in and out of existence. Each one was a different shape, some tall and narrow, others short and wide, but all of them shared one unsettling thing. They had no faces, only empty, gaping voids where eyes should have been. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, each inhalation like sucking in tar. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I staggered backward, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was frozen, rooted to the spot by some unseen force. The hum had turned into a low growl, vibrating through my skull, and the whispers rose again, swirling around me in a dizzying cacophony. "Choose!" they all chanted, their voices overlapping, becoming a single pulsating demand. "Choose!" One of the figures reached out with an elongated skeletal hand, its fingers curling like claws. I couldn't look away. It wasn't the grotesque shape of the hand that terrified me, it was the feeling, the sheer presence of it, as if it had existed long before I ever came here and would continue to exist long after I was gone. My mind reeled. I thought of the numbers, the ones scrawled on my wrist, now burned into my skin. They were still there, still glowing faintly, and as the figure's hand neared, I knew the truth. There was no escape, there was no out. The choice wasn't about whether I would leave or not, it was about how I would die. The shadow stopped inches from me, its clawed hand hovering in the air, waiting. "Choose," it whispered, its voice chillingly calm. I shook my head violently, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "I don't know what you want from me," I cried, desperate for a way out, but the more I struggled, the tighter the air became, wrapping around me, squeezing the life out of me. The figures loomed closer, closing in from all sides. The hum was deafening now, like an endless storm, vibrating my entire being. I could feel it in my teeth, in my bones. They were everywhere, the shadows merging with the darkness surrounding me. And then I saw it. In the center of the void, beyond the figures, a new shape emerged. A tall, imposing figure wrapped in robes made of the same shifting blackness. Its face was a smooth, featureless mask, but its presence was undeniable. It watched me with an intensity that cut through the overwhelming hum, like it was waiting for me to make my move. Choose. The word came again, but this time it wasn't just the figures speaking. It was the air itself, the entire space pressing in on me. I felt the weight of it like an anchor pulling me down. The figure stepped forward, and I felt its power, its will, like an invisible hand gripping my chest. I couldn't think. The choice was impossible. Whatever decision I made, I knew it wouldn't end well, but the shadowed figure didn't wait for me to decide. Its hand reached forward and touched my forehead with cold, unfeeling fingers. The moment its fingers touched my forehead, the world shattered. The hum, the whispers, the endless dark, they all blurred together into one overwhelming sensation, like an avalanche crashing through my mind. The pressure was unbearable. I could feel the weight of the figures pressing in around me, suffocating me, each one closing the gap between us with predatory patience. Their hollow, faceless forms seemed to distort, rippling like smoke in the air, and the space itself began to stretch and twist. Everything felt wrong. I was no longer in control of my thoughts. I couldn't focus on anything, couldn't separate the chaos in my head from the world around me. The figures surrounded me now, their proximity suffocating like a mass of hungry ghosts, each one whispering my name in soft, guttural tones. Choose, choose, choose. The word had no meaning anymore. It was like a mantra, repeating itself over and over, pulling at me, digging deeper and deeper into my consciousness. Each time they spoke it, I felt a shard of my own identity slip away, replaced by an unbearable weight of uncertainty. I wanted to scream, but my voice was lost, swallowed by the hum that roared inside my skull. The air around me felt colder, colder than anything I had ever known. It wasn't just the temperature, it was as if the very essence of the space was freezing me from the inside out. My thoughts were scattered, my body trembling, barely able to remain upright. The numbers, 690452, they burned into my mind like a brand, flashing in my thoughts, searing my vision. 690452. The pressure on my chest was too much. I could feel myself breaking. I stumbled back, my legs unsteady, desperate to get away from the figures closing in. My mind spun in circles, unable to grasp onto anything solid, anything real. There was only the endless hum and the empty faces around me, staring at me, waiting. The air was so thick now I could barely breathe. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I could barely move. My body was paralyzed by the weight of their presence. It was like they had always been here and I was the one out of place. My hands shook violently as I reached for my wrist, trying to see the numbers once more, trying to remind myself that this wasn't real, that this was just a stupid dare, that I was just trapped in a nightmare. But when I looked down, my wrist was empty. The numbers were gone. A cold sweat dripped down my neck as the full weight of the silence hit me. I could still hear them, the whispers, but they had stopped chanting. Instead, they were speaking something else, something quiet and terrifying. You belong. The figures didn't need to say anything else. The words sank deep into my chest, wrapping around my heart like a vice. My stomach twisted into knots as the ground beneath me began to distort, pulling and warping in unnatural ways. The shapes, the whispers, everything was merging together, a living nightmare too complex for me to fully comprehend. I tried to push them away, but my hands passed right through them, as though they weren't even there. They weren't real, and yet they were. The paradox crushed me. You belong, the voice whispered again, and in that moment I realized the terrifying truth. I'd never been meant to escape. This wasn't about me trying to run. This was where I was meant to be. The figures drew closer still, their presence overwhelming, their voids staring into me, through me. And then I felt it, cold fingers, skeletal and tight, wrapping around my wrist. 690452. And then I understood. The fingers tightened around my wrist, colder than anything I had ever felt. And I gasped, trying to pull away, but they wouldn't let go. I had expected pain, the kind of excruciating hurt that comes with being touched by something unnatural. But instead, there was only a deep, heavy pressure, like being crushed from the inside out. It wasn't physical, it was mental, something twisting inside me, altering my perception of reality. I could feel it, the weight of their touch. But it wasn't just their touch anymore. It was something else, something that ran deeper than I could grasp, burrowing into my mind. The figure holding my wrist was silent, but there was something in the air, something dark and suffocating. The other figures were closing in around me now, slowly, methodically. They didn't speak anymore. The only sound was the hum, louder now, but underneath it I could hear something else. A low, guttural whisper, a murmur that seemed to come from all of them at once. It wasn't a language, it wasn't even words. It was a sound, a vibration that felt like it was pulling something from deep within me, something ancient, something primal. It made my skin crawl. And then the whispers formed into a sentence, one I wasn't sure I should understand. The choice has already been made. I shuddered, my breath ragged, as the figures around me seemed to pulse and shift. Their movements became erratic, as though they were no longer bound by any logic I could comprehend. They stretched and contorted, but they never fully came into focus. The shadows, the darkened void, were consuming everything, me, the space, the very air around me. It was as if they were wrapping the world itself into their grasp. The one holding my wrist leaned closer, its faceless void mere inches from my own face. I could feel it, a weight pressing into me, something cold and alien pushing through my thoughts. "You belong," it whispered again, but this time I could feel the hunger behind the words. It wasn't just that they were waiting for me to choose, they were waiting for something more. They weren't interested in my decision, they were preparing to consume. The darkness deepened. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The pull on my wrist tightened as if they were dragging me into the abyss. But then I realized with chilling clarity that they weren't pulling me into the darkness. They were pulling the darkness into me. And that was worse. The figures didn't need to speak. Their intentions were becoming clear. This wasn't some simple test, some game to be played out for my amusement or curiosity. This was something else. They were feeding. Not on my body, but on something deeper. My thoughts, my essence, my very identity. I realized then the full weight of the truth. I hadn't come here by mistake. The numbers had called me here, the app, the TikTok trend. It wasn't just a game. It was a ritual, a summoning, and I was the offering. The whispers swirled around me again, but this time there was something else hidden in their tones, something that wasn't just curious, but malicious. There was a deep, ancient hunger in the way they spoke, an unmistakable desire to consume, to destroy. I tried to fight back, to break free, but it was too late. The pull was too strong, and the shadows had already started to weave themselves into my consciousness. The darkness closed in like a living thing, a pressure so intense I could feel it against my skin, inside my chest, as if my very soul were being drawn toward it. The figures stood around me, their hollow eyes unblinking, and in that moment I knew what they wanted, me, but not just my body. They wanted my mind, my memories, every part of me that made me who I was. I felt the pull of their hunger, and something inside me snapped, "No!" The word came out hoarse, barely a whisper, but it was there. The resistance. My will was still there, somewhere beneath the overwhelming weight of the darkness. I could still fight. I clenched my fists and squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the void pressing in from all sides. The air was thick, like a fog that tried to swallow me whole, but I fought against it. Focus, I told myself, focus on something real. I thought of my phone, the screen, the numbers, the app. It was all connected somehow. A part of me didn't want to believe it, didn't want to admit that this game had brought me here, but I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. They were here because of it, and I was here because of it. I opened my eyes, focusing on the empty space between me and the shadow that held my wrist. The darkness twisted and curled, but I pushed against it, forcing myself to hold on to that one thread of reality. It wasn't just me here. My friends, my followers, they'd all been pulled into this in some way, but I hadn't come this far just to disappear into the dark. With every ounce of strength I had, I jerked my wrist away from the figure's grip. My fingers burned from the contact, but I didn't care. The air around me seemed to resist, like 1,000 unseen hands trying to hold me in place, but I fought harder. The ground beneath my feet shook, and I felt it, the shift as if something was about to snap. "Let me go," I breathed, the words coming with more force this time. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared into the void of the figure's face, or rather, where its face should have been. "You can't have me." The figure didn't respond, but I could feel it, like a pull deep in my chest, something cold and invisible wrapping around my heart. It was the hunger again, growing stronger, more insistent. The others circled closer, their empty faces now distorting into horrific shapes, their limbs twisting unnaturally as if they were feeding on my fear, on my resistance. I staggered backward, my knees buckling, but I caught myself, forcing my hands to the ground to steady myself. The air tasted sour, thick with the weight of their presence. The whispers filled my ears again, louder this time. The sound was overwhelming, like 100 voices in my head, each one pressing its way into my thoughts. But then, in the chaos, something changed. A sudden clarity broke through. It was like a spark in the dark, a realization so simple yet profound. The numbers, 690452, they weren't just a part of the ritual, they were a trigger. I didn't need to choose. They wanted me to think I did, but the game had already been set into motion long before I ever stumbled onto it. They had been waiting for me to fight, to struggle, but if I could break the pattern, if I could stop playing their game... I breathed out slowly, trying to center myself. The hunger clawed at me, but I held my ground. "No," I whispered again, louder this time. "I won't be your sacrifice." The hum fluctuated, growing harsher, more violent. The shadows recoiled, as if the words had struck them, as if they weren't used to being defied. The pull on my wrist lessened, and I dared to glance down at the spot where the figure had touched me. My skin was pale, almost translucent, but the burn was fading. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. The shadows weren't retreating, but for the first time, I felt like I had some control. I needed to keep resisting, to stop playing by their rules, but how? The figure's grip on my wrist had loosened, but I could feel their presence pressing in on me like a vice. The dark had wrapped itself around me, thick and suffocating, curling through my lungs, dragging my breath from me. The whispers were louder now, piercing my thoughts, twisting them into knots. Their cold, faceless voids surrounded me, and I could hear them moving, each one circling, their movements in sync, as if waiting for something, waiting for me to give in. My vision swam, and the world felt like it was spinning, stretching like rubber as I stood there, rooted in place. My knees shook, my legs threatening to give out, but I refused to fall. I clenched my teeth against the overwhelming urge to scream, to beg for release, but I couldn't let them win. Their hunger had a shape, a suffocating pressure that filled every inch of the space, and I realized with growing horror that I was not just fighting to escape, I was fighting to keep my own mind intact. "No!" I gasped, shoving against the air as if pushing them away. But the air was no longer air. It was thick and fluid, as if reality itself had turned to liquid, refusing to obey the rules I had known. The ground beneath me trembled, and I could feel the presence of something ancient, something insidious, pulling at my very soul. My hand reached for my phone instinctively, desperate to cling to anything that felt real. The screen was cracked, black as night, but the numbers were there again, 690452. I felt the sharpness in my chest, a deep pang of panic. This wasn't just a game, it never was. The numbers, the ritual, it had all been leading up to this moment, this choice. But now I understood there was no choice. The struggle wasn't about deciding heaven or hell. It was about who could survive the longest without losing themselves. With every passing second, I felt a part of me slipping away. My thoughts were no longer my own. They were intertwined with the hum, with the void, with the figures around me. The hunger within them was not just about devouring me. It was about breaking me down, piece by piece. Every doubt I'd ever had, every fear, every regret, they were all becoming part of the darkness, part of the void that was swallowing me whole. "Fight it," I whispered to myself, but the words were hollow. How could I fight something that was in me? How could I push against it when it was slowly becoming a part of who I was? I couldn't stop shaking. My mind was unraveling, and I could feel it. They were winning. I could see their faces now, their distorted forms shifting and writhing in the space around me, like creatures made of smoke and hunger. Their figures flickered in and out of existence, each one getting closer, their movement predatory, patient. I fought to stay focused, to hold on to any last shred of resistance. I pressed my palm against my forehead, trying to shake off the thoughts that were clawing at me. I was still here, I was still me, wasn't I? But the whispers grew louder. Their voices were no longer a chorus. They were singular, personal, intimate. "Give in, it's easier this way." I felt the words like a blade against my spine. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was an invitation, a promise of release, of peace, if only I would surrender. I could feel it now, the gnawing temptation, the call to give up, to let the darkness swallow me whole. It would be so easy, wouldn't it? Let them in, let go, stop fighting. But no, I couldn't let myself fall into their trap. They wanted me to surrender, to believe that the suffering was too much to bear. They wanted me to be a part of them. But I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. I refused. "No!" I screamed the word, but it was drowned out by the hum, by the whispers. My chest burned, and the air thickened with every breath I took. The ground shifted again, threatening to swallow me whole. But I refused to be consumed. I would not give in to them. My thoughts were slipping, but there was still something there, something solid, something that reminded me of who I was. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stand taller, forcing myself to focus on that one thing. The truth that this wasn't a game, this wasn't just about choosing, it was about resisting. If I could just hold on, I thought, if I could just hold on long enough. I was barely holding on to myself. The world around me had dissolved into a whirlwind of noise and darkness. The figures circled closer, their shadows flickering in and out, growing larger and more oppressive with each passing moment. Their whispers, no, not whispers anymore, their voices filled my head, a maddening cacophony that threatened to tear me apart. "Let go," they urged. "Let go of the pain. Let go of the fight." The pressure in my chest grew, as if I were drowning in the very air I breathed. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. The figures were inside me now, their voices echoing in every thought, every memory, every shred of my identity. There was nothing real left, just the gnawing sensation of my own unravelling. It was as though I was being pulled in every direction, each figure's influence wrapping around my mind like a vice, squeezing harder, trying to force me to forget who I was. "Just let go," the voice inside me urged, smoother this time. "Don't fight it, you don't have to anymore." I stumbled, my body shaking violently. My knees felt like they were going to buckle, my hands trembling so hard I could barely keep them pressed to my sides. I was losing it. The reality I had known, the things that used to ground me, everything was slipping through my fingers like sand in the wind. I couldn't stop the tears from spilling over. I was drowning. I was drowning in this madness. And then, for the briefest moment, the voices paused. The dark figures stopped circling. There was a stillness, a quiet, a breath. It felt as if everything had stilled, like time had been suspended, and I thought, just for a second, that I could escape it. But I was wrong. The pressure in my head exploded, my vision fractured, and everything around me shattered. It wasn't a physical break, it was worse than that. It was a mental collapse, a rupture deep within my soul. I felt my thoughts splinter like glass cracking, every part of me breaking into 1,000 pieces. I couldn't hold on anymore. The figures had won. They didn't need to touch me. They didn't need to drag me into the dark. They'd already taken what they wanted. My mind. I let out a strangled sob, unable to stop myself, and for the first time I felt a deep, crushing surrender. The darkness, those haunting whispers, had won. But just before I could lose myself completely, something flickered, a small, bright light, something so faint I almost missed it. It was a memory, a thread of who I was, a glimmer of the person I had been before all of this. It was the tiniest spark of defiance. I grabbed at it. I clung to it with every ounce of strength I had left. I focused on that one thing, that sliver of resistance, because if I let go now, there would be nothing left of me. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. The voices screamed louder, the darkness pressed harder, but I wasn't done yet. Not yet. The light was gone. All that remained was the suffocating darkness, folding over me like a wet blanket, smothering everything that had been. My vision was a blur of shadows. No, not shadows. Faces. thousands of eyes all staring at me, but I could no longer tell if they were real or if they were simply a reflection of the chaos inside my mind. Every moment felt like I was being pulled deeper into a void, sucked into a space where the laws of time and reality no longer mattered. The figures were everywhere. They were me. They were inside me, all around me. Their voices were no longer whispers, but roars. They tore through my thoughts, each one fighting for dominance, each one trying to drown the last piece of me that was still fighting. I couldn't remember how long it had been, how long since I had last been myself. The memories were breaking apart, dissolving like ink in water. Faces that had once been clear were now indistinguishable. My family, my friends, my own face, all of them fading, becoming indistinct, forgotten. There was no escape. "No!" I whispered, the word raw and broken. My mouth felt dry like sandpaper. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could barely bring myself to breathe. Every breath felt like I was inhaling the void itself. My chest ached, my heart pounding against my ribs as though trying to escape, but there was nowhere to go. I was already trapped. I had always been trapped. The figures were closer now, their faces, if you could call them faces, contorting with grotesque hunger. They did not touch me. No, they didn't need to. The real horror was in the influence they had over me, the way they wrapped themselves around my thoughts, suffocating them. I could feel them inside my mind, peeling apart my defenses, unraveling the very core of who I was. "You don't belong here," one of them said, its voice like a death rattle, a whisper from the abyss. The words echoed through my skull, vibrating in my teeth, spreading into my brain like poison. "You never did." I felt a wave of confusion crash over me. Had I? Had I ever belonged anywhere? Was I just a vessel, a puppet waiting to be consumed? Was I ever really alive? The more I fought, the more the darkness claimed me. Every part of me screamed for release, but it wasn't a physical release. It wasn't escape from the figures, it was from myself, from the me I had once been. The very concept of identity was fraying, tearing apart at the seams. There was a moment, a fleeting moment, when I thought I could feel something still. A whisper of my old self, clinging desperately to the edges of reality. But it was slipping, fast. I could feel it, the erosion of everything. My memories, my desires, my very will to exist. They were becoming a smear that would soon be wiped away entirely. "Please," I begged, but I didn't know to whom. I didn't know if I was begging the figures or begging myself. "I don't want this. I don't want to disappear." But the darkness didn't answer. It didn't need to. It was already too late. The figures were almost inside me now, pulling apart the last fragments of my consciousness. There was no sound, no breath, just the overwhelming weight of nothingness. And then it happened. The last sliver of resistance snapped. I fell. It wasn't just darkness anymore. It was nothing. No shapes, no sounds, no air to breathe, no ground beneath my feet. I was weightless, suspended in an infinite, oppressive void that felt as though it had always been here, as though it had always been waiting for me. There were no longer any figures circling around me. They were inside me. Every whisper, every temptation, every glimpse of an existence I had once called my own had been consumed. I was a hollow shell, a fading echo of who I used to be. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. The very act of thinking felt foreign, unnatural, as though my mind had forgotten how. All that was left was a silent scream, a part of me still fighting, still feeling, but buried under layers of absolute suffocating nothingness. And then there was a flash, a sudden violent jolt to my awareness. The figures were there again, but this time they weren't just shadows. Their forms were solid, real, more horrifying than ever. Their faces were grotesque parodies of human expression, twisted, as though they were mocking the very idea of existence. They didn't speak this time. They didn't need to. The air itself spoke to me. "You belong here." I felt it, the truth, as it sank deep into my soul. I had never belonged in the world I thought I had known. I'd never been real. The figures weren't just figures. They were part of me, part of what I had been created to become. I wasn't a human. I wasn't even a person anymore. I was a mistake, a thing born from this void, this dark place, a part of something ancient and horrible that had waited centuries to claim me. "You've always belonged here." The weight of it hit me, with the force of a tidal wave, crashing through the remnants of my fractured mind. I had never fought them, I had fought myself. The resistance, the fear, the desire to escape, it had all been part of the illusion. I had been chosen from the very beginning. There was no escape, there was no return. I felt a strange, almost serene detachment as the realization settled in. The pieces of myself that I had fought to hold on to, memories of my life, of who I had been, were nothing more than fragile constructs, fragile illusions designed to keep me from the truth. I had been destined to be consumed by this place, by this void, and now I was finally free. The last thread of my old self snapped completely. The final vestiges of my humanity burned away like dry paper, leaving nothing but emptiness in its place. And then I was nothing. There was no more struggle, no more fear. There was only peace and the void. Thank you for joining me here at Nightmare Theatre. My name is Arthur Pembroke. We do story narrations every night at 6 p.m. and live movie matinees at 1 p.m. on Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Make sure to stay tuned, and I'll see you again tomorrow night.